In the US today, there are two trials making news, both of them linked to the November presidential elections. In California, the president's son, Hunter Biden, is facing 9 charges related to tax fraud and evasion. The indictment said he failed to pay at least $1.4 million in federal taxes while spending most of his money on drugs and escorts. At the last minute today, he entered what is known as an Alford plea, entering a guilty verdict while still maintaining his innocence. We'll talk about that in a second. Meanwhile, over in Washington, Donald Trump was back in court over the revised indictment linking him to the January 6 riots on Capitol Hill. Lawyers for Donald Trump have entered a not guilty plea to the revised charges brought by the special counsel Jack Smith. The hearing was adjourned this afternoon without any trial date being set. Trump's attorneys, of course, trying to push for a delay until the election has been held. Let's speak to our good friend Joe Moreno, former federal prosecutor and Republican strategist. Always good to have you on, Joe. Nice to see you. An Alford deal. I've never heard of an Alford plea deal. How do courts tend to view it?
Christian, most Americans have never heard of an Alford deal. They're fairly unusual. I've had difficult clients, but I have to tell you, if I said, let's figure out a way to antagonize a judge and the prosecutors by going in on the day of trial and changing our plea and asking for an Alford plea, which, of course, the prosecutors have to approve. It's actually a kind of a deal. I mean, I have to think it was quite a stir in court this morning, and it's still going on as we speak. So, but yeah, it's a special arrangement. It's basically a situation where a defendant says, look, I am maintaining that I am not guilty, but I acknowledge that there's so much evidence against me, a jury will most likely find me guilty. So it has to go to the highest levels of the Justice Department for approval, and there's no guarantee he'll get it. So at this point, it's really in the hands of the judge to say, look, we can put things off, and you can roll your dice with the Justice Department to see if they'll approve it, despite the fact you've now made them really angry, or you can give us a clean plea and just plead guilty. Or the third option is we go to trial right now, which is the way it was supposed to be as of this morning.
Because we should remember the background to this, that there was a plea deal that was originally agreed, which involved him having possession of a weapon while under the influence of drugs, but there was also some tax charges involved in that. If that plea deal had have gone ahead in Delaware, then he would have been protected from this. But it fell apart because the Justice Department thought it went over the odds. So why would they consider an Alford deal in this case?
Well, that's right. That was a fantastic deal last summer. That basically would have reduced both of these cases to 2 tax misdemeanors, not felonies, and a suspended conviction of the gun charges, which means if you're good for a year, the charges disappear. It was a fantastic plea arrangement. And the fact that it fell apart because really both sides couldn't seem to agree on its terms, even though they had spent months working on it, so it was really a failure on both sides. That would have been a fantastic solution. So you're right. Now, 1 year later, as the government has prepared evidence and witnesses and had many hearings before a judge, to now say, hey, you know what? Let's go back to the negotiating table and get that deal back on the table. I don't know. I think regardless of who your father is, I think the Justice Department will not look kindly on something like this. So I don't know how far this is going to go.
We'll see whether it flies. Let's talk about Donald Trump in Washington. The judge said the election is not relevant to the trial. So what does that mean? Is she going to schedule hearings in the run-up to the November election?
Well, hearings, yes. I mean, we've had hearings in that case for over a year now, and I don't think that's a big deal. She is correct that an election should not affect a trial either way, meaning it should not rush a trial to get it done before an election, or it should not mean the trial should be delayed because of an election. So I'm not surprised that that's the right thing for her to say. I do think, though, that for all those people who thought that a trial was even possible before November's election, no way. I mean, we're talking about months, possibly years before this case will ever go to trial, because all of those immunity issues that the Supreme Court decided on a few months ago all have to be litigated now at the trial court level, and they're subject to appeal. So if Judge Chutkan rules one way or the other on each individual immunity holding, either the prosecution or the defense can appeal. And where does that ultimately go? Back to the Supreme Court. So this could go on in circles for a very long time. So I like what she said about this not being political, but there's no way under any circumstances this would have gone to trial in the next 2 months.
In respect of this revised indictment, how does it look different to you since the Supreme Court ruled on immunity?
Very little, and I'm really not convinced that this is going to solve the government's problems. This results from the Fisher case, which says that the government can only use an obstruction of Congress charge in very certain circumstances, basically to destroy evidence that Congress was going to review. It does not really apply, I believe, in this situation where the allegation is that Trump and his supporters prevented Congress from counting electoral college votes. So the superseding indictment, it took some language out, and it downplayed Trump's role as president and upplayed his role as a candidate and tried to get around the immunity and the obstruction of Congress rulings from the Supreme Court. I'm not convinced it's going to really change it, though. So I think that, again, is subject to appeal. So that's yet another one of the several avenues here that will likely delay this case for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, just to give people a flavour of what they're talking about here, one of the things the Trump team wanted to decide ahead of the trial is whether the allegations made by his Vice President Mike Pence in that indictment are immune, whether it comes under his presidential remit, Joe.
That's right. And it's not an easy one, right? Because was he acting as President Trump or was he acting as candidate Trump in those run-ups to January 6th when he was trying to pressure Vice President Pence to basically not count the electoral college votes that were voted against him in certain states? And so not an easy call, but probably not one that's going to get resolved anytime soon.
Joe, good to have your company. Thank you very much for coming on.